So I'm going to try something a little different today. Tons of cutting board videos out there. You can make cutting board videos, but I wanted to take and try to make a cutting board video that kind of shows you some of the simple tricks that a beginner can use to make your boards look like high quality. You always want some scrap left over, so you never want to try to make something exactly the final dimensions. You always want to go a little bit big, and that way you can cut down, or if there's any mistakes or errors along the way, which happens, you can then put in a feature which will then make the board more unique, thus you can charge more for it. You notice for some reason one of your joints didn't come out good. You can rip that joint out, re-glue it, you can add in a little strip and make it look purposeful. Don't ever try to patch anything. If it doesn't come out the way you originally anticipated it, come up with a solution, and don't try to hide it, try to accentuate it. So that's the very first thing, is if you try to hide something, then somebody's going to notice your patch job. You can make beautiful cutting boards, any woodworking project for that matter, without having to spend a ton of money on tools. You just need to put forth the effort and want to make something nice. Just like I have a rip cut blade on here. I want to do something more precision, a little bit nicer. So I'm going to take off this blade and put the proper blade on. So many people never change their blades on their saw. So the whole purpose of this video is to kind of show you that you can do some of this stuff on the cheap. Having to work hard because you don't have the best tools will make you a better woodworker, because a expensive tool will not make you a better woodworker, but it will make it easier to be a good woodworker. But by using a zero clearance insert, it helps keep the wood from splintering. It's going to make a nicer edge on it. And this particular blade I just put in is what they call a glue line blade. And it's supposed to make a cut smooth enough that you can glue without having to sand or joint up to, I think, 1.25 inch thick lumber. So I do believe spending a little bit more and getting a glue line blade will save you from having to spend $800, $1,500 on a big joiner. And then we're going to use this little small jig. This was a micro jig kit. It came with a couple of clamps and a router bit. So this little sled here is 3 foot. My lumber is about 3 foot, so we should be okay with that. But you have the bit, so you could make a sled any size you want. And as long as you can keep, you've got a straight edge on it, and you keep it up against your fence tight, you're going to get a perfectly straight edge down there. That all you need is one of these little cheap feather boards. Want to make sure you're behind the blade. That you got this down here. You get it up here good and tight. We lock that sucker down, and now this is going to be up against our fence, and so this is going to, slide perfectly, and we don't have to worry about accidentally coming off and messing up our cut. We're going to take one of these boards, and since we've got our edge right here, we know that the saw is going to cut right to that edge. So we want to place this board just barely. Now, we paid a lot of money for this wood, so we don't want to throw away any more than we have to, but we want to make sure we cut all the way so that we have a good straight edge that we can then reference everything else off of. A lot of times when I cut these, I just cut less than a blade thickness, because all you need is just as long as it cuts the entire way. And then if I cut it and I see any little spots that it missed, well, then I can move my fence over, or move the board over in this case, because we don't want to move our fence, because we're going to cut all these with the fence and our sled in the same location. Before I cut this, we put our blade on. I didn't mention it, but anytime I change out my blades, I always take some cleaner. I use this 2050. It doesn't matter what kind you use. This is what I find that works the best, and it's the cheapest. But you want, if you look at the blade and there's any kind of residue on the edge of that blade, clean it off. You're going to make a poor cut if you sit there with a bunch of sap on your blade, especially with these exotics. A lot of them have a lot of oils and stuff in them. And so you want to make sure that you're starting with a good clean blade. All right, last one before we cut the board. But the whole purpose of this video is giving you all these little tricks that I have picked up over the years. Cheap little things, $10, $15 for these little angle finders. It should be on 0. Stick it on the side of your blade. Make sure that your blade isn't, touching. There we go. And make sure you're not on a tooth. And let's see, I haven't checked this one, but all right, so we're 89.9. So my blade is not at a 90-degree angle. And believe it or not, that 0.10 will make a difference. So before we cut a board, I need to get my blade straight. Okay, another quick tip. When we're cutting these down, one, we're cutting a side that's smooth. When we stack them over here, we want to make sure that we keep that smooth side that we know is perfectly straight all together. We don't want to be swapping these around because like on this board, it may not be super obvious, but we know that this one's perfectly flat. So this is the side we're going to reference off of every time. So keep those straight. When you're trying to decide which side of the board we're going to cut off, on the very first cut, because we are going to try to take off just as little as possible, and then we're going to cut our boards as we need it out of it. And then the leftover, if we're cutting a 1-inch thick board or an 1 1/4 board, we may have a 1/2 or a 3/4 inch left over at the end. So that's why we don't want to try to cut off a bunch. This particular piece of wood here, we've got a bunch of splits and stuff down here. So from here over, this board's worthless. I'm not going to use this last little bit of the wood. So what I'm going to do is instead of trying to cut this off in the beginning and then may come up just short over here, I'm going to cut from my best side, get that perfectly straight, and then we're going to cut as much good out of it as we can. Okay, so we're talking about saving money. So this board here, I don't know, may have been $40, but I'm not going to use it because once I started cutting through here, at one point when this was all together, this side was perfectly straight. We straightened it up on our little jig, and then as I started cutting it, it started releasing the tension out, and you can see how bad it's curved there. It's just not worth it. I'm going to throw this to the side, and that's just part of saving money, because if you sit here and try to fight it, and then you end up doing something stupid, get your hand too close to the blade, and then it binds up. Hospital visit is a whole lot more expensive than this one little cheap piece of board. So you'll be saying that $20 a board foot sure was cheap. So, again, this is all about saving money here. So definitely that's going to save us some money by throwing that board in the trash. Okay, so here's all of our strips we just cut. So now these are 1 3/8 inches thick. That gives me a 1/16, to plane down on top and bottom. If I don't get the board just right, and I'll still have 1 1/4 inches. For me, 1 1/4 inches is about the minimum thickness I want for my cutting boards, because I want something that feels good in the hand. So what I've done here, so these are the boards we're going to work with. Make 3 high quality boards, and like there's some surface mess up on there. There's a couple of holes here and there. So that will give us 1/4 of the strips that we can take out, and we're not pressed to try to use imperfected lumber. Okay, so now we got all of our boards cut up. We went through, picked out all of the good boards. These boards over here all have some sort of defect with them. Got a hole or a bad spot or something. But these, we can glue these up right now. And if you see, I'm just barely pushing in, and that's tight enough. That's all, that you need to clamp. And that's the thing about just taking your time, using those feather boards, using those jigs. You don't have to have anything fancy. I did this on a $75 saw and get the same results. But you take your time and you get those good tight joints. And so if you can't just squeeze it with your hand, and it be a perfect joint there, you need to throw it to the side. You know, I've got some of these boards here. They have a little rough spot on the edge. They got a hole. So we put them to the side. So now I've got 1, 2, 3, you know, nice. We can make these, just glue them together, throw some chamfers on them, wax them up, and they're good to go. We've got one here. Now these were, when I cut the boards, I was cutting these about 16. You know, they were 36 inches, so I've got about 18-inch pieces. So these are a little bit longer over here. And I can make one little bit longer board. So let's see, that was actually a little over 19. So by the time I cut it down, 18 and a half, 19 inches. Or what we could do, since we have all of this wood here, when we could throw this in the back and then have scrap to build little projects around, or we can go ahead, flip these boards around and then lay them over here on the side, glue them up like that, and the reason why is because it takes less boards to get the same width. Glue them up, plane them down, and then we can come back and cut them 1.5 inches or 2 inches and do an end grain board. And that way, like this here has got this hole. We can cut this off, and then we could use that piece there. And so as long as we got over a 2-inch piece, we could side glue them. You know, you want to glue the largest pieces that you can, but we can go ahead and cut out all these bad spots, and then we can still save these boards and come back here and make probably about yay wide is what we would need. And so now, you know, we've got enough boards here because we're going to be going thickness. So the two here is about 1.5 inches. So now we could make a board about that size with an end grain. It takes more wood to make end grain, but we're able to use up some of this wood, you know, that we couldn't use before that had some kind of defect in it. You know, so all these little pieces, we'll be able to go still use the wood, and now we can charge 2.5 times the price. So if we're going to charge $125 for this board, you know, we can charge $250 for this end grain board. You know, it all depends on what your market bears, but I've found that as long as you've got a quality product, there is a person that will buy it. It just depends on selling it in the right place. Have confidence in yourself and price your stuff appropriately. And, you know, sometimes, you know, if you have something that's a little bit special, go ahead and jack it on up there and not ever anticipate selling it, but go ahead and mark it up 3 times, you know, or double what you think it should be. And then, you know, you're out there at one of these shows, and you may be surprised somebody come by, and that might be the first item you sell. Everybody has their spot that they want to shop at. So let's go ahead and get these boards glued up. Okay, so we don't want to make a huge mess, but we don't want to skimp either. Glue is cheap. You know, if you're going to sell a quality product, you can't have it falling apart on somebody. Word of mouth is definitely your friend, as long as you're doing a quality product. So I've kind of got it set up here. This is the layout that we're going to do. So I want to be sure, and when I put these out here to stack them up, that I keep them in the correct order. And then also you need to do something to keep them from getting mixed up whenever you're going to swap from one board to another. So once you start putting the glue on them, then, you know, at that point there, you're pretty much set. There's no, you're at that point of no return. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to slide those apart, and then I'll put something up here. So we'll just set this right there so that I remember that that's where I'm going to start a new board at. And then this is going to be, now I always like to turn, especially on these little clamps like this, make sure that they're all the way unwound. And then again, I like to use one of these little tips here, and that way I can squeeze the glue out and spread it, but I do have an extra little spreader here if I need it. So let's go ahead and get started now. So if you're still watching this far into the video, thank you. I appreciate every one of you. I wouldn't be doing this if people didn't watch these videos. You know, if I did something you think's not right, you know, call me out on it. Put it in the comments. If there's another tip, you know, that I missed, put it in here, because this is really for the basic people who didn't have shop class. This is the same boards that we made back in the 6th grade. I was lucky enough to go to a school that we had a shop class. So, you know, we certainly need to help each other out in this community. And if there's anything I can ever do, let me know. And if you want to do something for me, you can always subscribe. You know, it definitely helps the channel out. And look for a future video, because we're going to give all these cutting boards away if I can figure out how to do a giveaway through YouTube. You know, I'm going to just go ahead and everything we made in this video, probably we'll just give it out to some of the viewers here. Now, I actually have some Bessie clamps. Those parallel clamps from Bessie, they're the best to glue up this kind of stuff with. But I wanted to show you don't need expensive clamps. These are some modified Harbor Freight clamps. I used 3 clamps to clamp 3 boards, and every seam came out perfect on these boards. So, I mean, you really don't need expensive clamps to get good glue ups. Okay, so it's been about 30-45 minutes, depending on how hot it is in your shop. You want the glue to kind of skin over so I can touch it and it doesn't come off of my hands. You know, but there are still little bubbles, so it's not fully dry. You can kind of smush it a little bit. You can just get a cheap paint scraper. It does the same thing. And all you want to do is just scratch that off and get as much of the excess glue off as possible. Makes it much more quicker and easier than after it fully dries, because that glue, once it fully dries, is difficult to get off. Also, if you try to wipe it up when it's wet, it just kind of puts a coating across the whole thing. So 30 minutes to an hour is usually about the best time to go ahead and clean this up. I'll just take a paper towel. I pulled the boards out of the clamps. Now what I've done is I just went ahead and took my sander and sanded them down flat. I didn't go all the way. I started with some 80 grit, got them down 80 grit so they're nice and flat. See this cast iron tabletop? Make sure everything's nice and solid here. They still got some sanding that needs to be done on them, but they're smooth enough, they're in our plane, that we can now cut these down to our size. Like, you know, say we always wanted to make them a little bit big, so I'm going to look around the edges, because a lot of times your imperfections are going to be around the edges. So if you have a spot on the edge, you want to be sure that you cut that out. So these all look like they glued up perfect. Okay, so we got this end grain board, and these edges here need to be straightened up. But we need to get a reference side first. So what we can do is we can put our jig right here against our fence, and then we take a straight board that we a board that we know is straight, put that up against our fence. So now I can see the center line right here. I can go ahead and, all right, so now I've got my center line straight, and then I can go ahead, clamp the board down to our jig, and then I can move over and then rip this here, and then that way I get a nice straight side. This will be my reference side. I'm going to take and try to split these about in half. You know, I don't want to just straighten it up, because then this is going to be like 7/8 of what the one next to it is. So again, I want to try to make this purposeful looking. So I'm going to go ahead and just split this outside ring either into the same size as the blocks are sideways, or split it in half, whichever way it works out. Okay, so now that I've got my one face here that's ripped nice and smooth, then I can just use that up against my fence to go ahead and rip the other side. Okay, so for me, unless I'm doing a large butcher block type board that, you know, you're going to put a whole brisket on and slice, I'm not worried about a juice groove. The most common cutting board is about, you know, 16, 18 inches. I think chamfer looks classy. You know, it's easy, but to me, it just looks a lot better than a round over. You can set your blade on a 45 and cut it, or we can get a router bit on a 45 and use the router bit. It doesn't really matter. I mean, router bit's gonna be exactly 45. You can set your blade here. The thing is when we set our blade, so as long as our boards are exactly the same, we can go through and cut all of our boards. But like these here are 1/2 inch difference, so I've got to readjust my fence every time to try to get the proper cut. So just to make it easy, I'm going to use a cheap router bit, and then we're going to use the router to do our chamfer. Okay, so now we got our chamfers cut. We just got to sand them. And now this is something that, you know, I tried getting the Diablo screens and stuff, but this 3M Cubitron, this stuff here, I have been sanding with this with brand new sheet, swap it out with a piece of this, and you can drastically tell the difference between, I don't even know why I've kept those old ones in there, but this stuff here will cut your sanding time in half. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just cover these boards with pencil marks on both sides. And then even though these were already sanded flat with the 80 when we got the glue off, I'm going to go ahead and start again with the 80 because we still need to do these edges. Now the end grain takes a little bit more time, but we're going to go ahead starting with our 80, and then I'm going to work my way through the grits. I go 80, 120, and then 220. And okay, so I've sanded these all down to 120 with the orbital sander. I'm going to raise the grain. I'm just going to take a wet rag here, wipe these boards down, kind of start seeing what kind of colors you're going to have. Man, that's going to be a beautiful board there. Like I say, you don't have to soak it, but you want to get it good and wet, damp. And then you don't want to lay it flat. You want to set it up where it can get air all the way around it and let it dry off good. That's going to raise the grain. And then I like to do the final sanding with 220 by hand. And that way, you know, you're feeling every little inch, millimeter, wherever you think you're filling in, but you're filling every little piece of that board with your hands, which is exactly what your customers are going to do, is they're going to run their hand around that board. And if there's a rough spot, you want to find it and get it sanded flat before they do. Okay, so one of the most important things, if you're not proud enough to put your name on your product, you definitely should not be selling it. Yep. All right, so I messed that one up. So instead of trying to halfway do it, we're going to sand it down and start over. All right, so that took a little longer than I'd hoped. I tried doing a card scraper. I just wasn't getting it. So I tried to just hit it with some 220. It was in pretty deep. So I ended up had to go back to 150 or 120, resand down with 120, and then come back with the 220. Takes an extra 20 minutes or so, but that's like it never happened. You know, I didn't want to just hit one spot. I wanted to do the whole board when I was sanding, so I didn't have a little divot in that one little area. All right, so with this being the end grain, the iron just, and the board being so slick, just was like pushing it back out of the way. So let's go. So I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we were missing that fourth board. And the reason why is I make my homemade board butter or cat's goo. It's a Cat's Moses recipe, which is 100% medical grade mineral oil and beeswax. Well, you know, you make up a gallon at a time and the stuff will last, you know, for 1,000 cutting boards, but that's not the most economical. So I went on Amazon, and this Interstate WoodWorks, I checked them out. It's 100% mineral oil and beeswax. It's a little bit different of a ratio because it's a little bit thicker. And now you see there's almost none gone. And I did this board here, and it came out absolutely gorgeous. You know, it doesn't take a lot. Just, you know, you want to get a good schmoozing on there. And I want to, whenever I do my first coat, I want to make sure that I have, you know, like where you can see that it's still sticking up, you know. I don't want to just barely put a coat on there. I know a lot of people do the mineral oil baths, but I don't really like soaking my boards like that. It can soak up depending on the type of wood, too much of that oil, and then can start releasing it out later. And then depending on how soon you sell the board, you know, somebody could get this home and set it on the counter and then go to pick it up. And then they've got this oily, greasy stain, you know, and they call and you want to know what's going on. But as you see, you know, it's still, you know, waxy there. And what you want to do is you want to put on that to where you leave a kind of a thick coat on it. The mineral oil is going to soak into the wood, and then that's going to leave the wax on the wood. And just look how gorgeous that is. I mean, and this was because our wood we got, the supplier had given me some kind of, yeah, you know, it is what it is, but it was wood that I wasn't going to put in a regular cutting board, so I had to do something with it. And so what I did with it was chopped it up and made this out of it. So instead of losing all that lumber, now this board here is definitely the most expensive board in the pile. And this is what we made out of all that wood that had the holes and stuff in it. So I'm going to coat both sides. You always want to be sure you coat both sides. If you only do one side, it'll cause it to warp. And so I'm going to coat all these, and then I'm going to prop them up so that they can get air through on both sides. And then I'm going to come back in the morning and check them and see if all this wax is soaked in, or the mineral oil soaked in. And then I'm going to buff that wax out. And then if it's dry, I'm going to put another coat of that wax on and let it soak in, and then we're done. So I'm going to go ahead and put some affiliate links down in the description. As you see, these boards came out beautiful. That Interstate wax, it worked fantastic on these boards. The Milescraft FeatherBoard really helped keep those lines straight. The microjig system. And so I'm just going to include all those little tools that I used, and that way you can get them if you like.